We've been a bit short on music in Second House this season, and tonight we're going to make up for it. The piece is called Tubular Bells. It was written by a young Englishman, Mike Oldfield, when he was 17. He worked for 9 months to compose Tubular Bells, which takes up both sides of this LP. Oldfield used 20 instruments to make the original recording of that music, all of which he played himself. Grand piano, bass guitar, electric guitar, tin whistle, hammered organ, it goes on like the Guinness Book of Records.
It's like yesterday. It doesn't feel a long time ago at all. It was such a special time in my life. It was strange. Right after I'd finished it, I didn't want to know about it because it was such a big thing. And I'd kind of got it out of my system. And for about, well, 5, even 10 years, I didn't want to know about it. And I find it astonishing that it's lasted this long and that I'm here talking to you 40 years later all about it. And, it's very close and dear to my heart. I put on the old tapes and it's like I'm instantly transformed back to 1972, November 1972, which is when I started working on it.
Very few people knew who he was. It was sort of talked about in reverential tones. An album with 1 track on it, over 2 sides. You know, that's different.
It sold millions in the first couple of years of release, but it never stopped selling. So they now quote the figure of 16 million.
In the 70s, everyone had a copy of Tubular Bells. If you were in any gathering of people for any length of time, at some point Tubular Bells would come on the turntable.
Virgin going into space most likely wouldn't have existed if we hadn't hired that particular instrument.
When we made it, Michael was a mental wreck. He would walk round with his eyes wet with tears nearly all the time. He was in a terrible state.
Mike had a very difficult time with the fame of Tubular Bells. Lots of people calling him saying, "We want you to do this, we want you to do that." No, go away.
I was born in Reading, in Berkshire, in 1953. The name of the road was Western Elms Avenue. My father was a doctor, a GP. My mother used to be a nurse before she had us. I've got 2 older siblings, a brother Terry and a sister Sally.
He was very, very lively, very energetic, always dashing around and creating things. He had a gang of friends, and he was the ringleader, telling jokes, and he was very outgoing, very extrovert.
There was a little bit of music in the family. There was always a guitar hanging on the wall, which my dad would take down every Christmas, and he'd play 3 songs with 3 chords.
I, played folk guitar, so I showed Mike the 3 basic chords. And I thought, well, that'd keep him quiet, for a few months. And I think it was about 2 weeks later, and he was doing this extraordinary, running up and down the keyboard, loads of other chords. I mean, he just talked himself.
Well, when I was about 14 and Mike would have been 10 then, our mother definitely had some problems because I have a lot of memories from that period.
After me, she got pregnant again. I remember feeding her tummy and feeling the baby moving in there. One day, she just wasn't there, and she was gone for a long time.
All I know is that we had a garage full of baby things and the baby didn't come home. We were told that he had a hole in his heart, and we were spun all sorts of yarns about it.
Our dad told us that the baby had died and that Mummy wasn't coming home. She was going to go to a nice place by the sea. I later found out that the boy actually survived for a year. And he didn't have a hole in his heart, he was Down syndrome. His name was David. He must have been very frail because he only survived for a year or so. But then when she came home eventually, it was then the problems started.
She started being prescribed barbiturates, which are lethally addictive. The doctors prescribed them for insomnia.
Sometimes I would go into my mother and father's bedroom and I'd see her sitting on the bed, you know, just rocking backwards and forwards, howling, almost inhuman.
Then it became very dark, very difficult. We tended to lock ourselves in our bedrooms and do our own thing, and I think that's when Mike really started to hone his craft.
Mike just used to play and play and play. He sort of shut himself in his room a lot, and we didn't see him.
Whenever you went into his bedroom, he would be incredibly fast guitar playing. I mean, he became a prolific guitarist very, very quickly.
We used to travel around with my friends, playing at folk clubs from a very early age. Got paid £2 a night for a gig there.
I was 16, 17, and Mike was 12, 13. We all actually were, at this point, looking up to him, and I suppose being envious of the fact that he could just do this so naturally without seemingly having to put any effort or work into it. It just came out of him, and we were all busting a gut, as it were, to try and keep up with him.
It was 1968, and that was a very, very powerful year in the 60s. If you wanted to do something, you tended to just go and do it. Is the dark side. I was just coming up to do my finals. I said, I don't want to do this anymore. No, I'm going to be a pop singer. I'm going to get a record deal. I want to make a record now. So I was going to go and see Transatlantic. I had my demo, walked in to see... It was Nat Joseph, who was the MD, and he listened and said, oh, that's interesting, that's really unusual. Yes, I'm interested, but we need some musicians. I don't think just you and the guitar's quite enough. And I said, no problem, I've got a younger brother, he's a brilliant guitarist. Shall I bring him in? I don't want your Apollo frozen steel.
I first came across Mike Oldfield when he was in this duo with his sister Sally, called the Sally Angie. Teach my children to be. He was a very fine guitarist. There's no getting away from that. And he knew it. And he wanted to be treated with respect. And he was only bloody 15, you know, come on.
I remember one particular instance. Sally berated him. At that time, he thought, I'll hit 1,000 notes. And Sally would just stop and say, too many notes, Michael, you've got too many notes.
London was full of virtuoso guitar players, and he was such a precocious little prick. He really got up my nose, but they had a great potential. I was quite disappointed that we didn't hear anything more of them.
The demise started when I had the bright idea that we ought to do a bit of styling. I unfortunately went to see a dressmaker and asked her advice, and she came up with this idea of pink velvet for me, lime green for Mike. It didn't go down well at all. Mike was on to better things by that time.
I next came across Mike when he joined Kevin Ayres' band, The Whole World. The Whole World was part of a different scene, a general scene.
I just came in off the street, looking for somewhere to eat.
Kevin was the front man.
I find this small cafe.
Tall, looking kind of film star-ish.
Then I say, may I sit and
Mike was a good bass player.
For a while.
He had very clear ideas what he wanted the bass to play. He said, I don't want it just going boom, 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 boom.
Sit and stare at you for a while.
You've got to remember, I was only 16 when I joined, and to have 2 strings taken away from me and just 4 bass strings, I'm happy with that, so I would keep hitting the bass note of the chord, but in between I'd play little melodies.
That's all.
Around that time, Mike, Sally and I experimented with LSD.
Our present opinion about LSD is that LSD is something like an amplifier or catalyst which just manifests the unconscious processes in the brain.
When he was very, very young, he did LSD, and I think that probably had an effect on him, that he probably still has resonances even now.
I was living in a little flat. It was actually number 1 Victoria Square in Pimlico. And I do remember one extremely disturbing evening where people didn't look like anything recognizable. They almost looked like machines, biological machines. And it completely disturbed me.
You never believed a bad trip existed until you had one. It's just your worst fears, your worst nightmares. You know, hallucinating and all that, you think it's really cool and really good fun until it starts going wrong. And then you think, wow, this is not good.
At the time when I was 17, it was the end of the world for me. I didn't know what was going to happen. I was going to cease to exist. I'm going to die. I'm going to... It scared the life out of me.
From that time on, I think he had trouble. It triggered something in him which created an instability which took him years to get over.
He had to transform all that misery into something, you know, in his own psyche that kept him sane.
What it did was it made me retreat even more into my music. In a way, music was more real to me than the normal reality.
Here's this guy who finds life so hard, and music is his only escape. He described the music as a creature. It's this lovely creature who cuddles up against me and makes me feel better.
I moved into the house with Kevin Ayres on the top of Seven Sisters Road. The deal was Kevin would do the cooking and we had to do the washing up. That lasted not that long, maybe 6-9 months, I suppose. And then one day Kevin came to me and he said, this is not working for me. You know, and he basically disbanded the group. And, but part of that, he offered to lend me his tape recorder. It was a simple tape recorder, 2 tracks. Well, I can make some demos, I've got a tape recorder. So I took it up to my little room. I also borrowed the Farfisa organ from the keyboard player. And then I was thinking, right, I want to make something, a repetitive thing at the front. I thought Rainbow and Curved Air, Terry Riley. This sort of underground synthesizer, or the birth of the synthesizer. And I just played it straight away, like this. That is the Farfisa organ. These are the original tapes from Tubular Bells. I made the demos. I took them to EMI. There was a chap there called Nick Mobbs who kind of quite liked it, and he said he'd get back to me, but never did. I remember them taking them to CBS, who just thought I was crazy because it, you know, it didn't have any vocals, didn't even have any drums. And I gave up then.
So what's interesting about this story is how the 2 main protagonists come to meet. You have Mike Oldfield retreated in his bedroom, writing his masterwork, and there you have Richard Branson, who is also obsessed. He's obsessed with getting on with his future. He's been doing the student magazine, and he's looking for a business opportunity.
I decided not to risk launching a first-year student unless we had managed to get hold of enough cash from advertising to cover both printing and paper costs.
He started a magazine called Student, which was a disaster. Nothing he'd done up until then had really succeeded.
We started a mail order company that would sell any record from any record manufacturer for 10% to 25% less than the commercial price.
He was a chancer. He was prepared to gamble and go for it. He was perceived as a visionary, putting it all together. But really, I mean, he was importing records illegally and flogging them, right? He was a second-hand car salesman.
Being independent, one of the major advantages we have is that we can make policy decisions quickly. If we want to produce a record, we don't have to have a mass of meetings. We can immediately say, yes, let's go ahead and produce it.
So the saga continues that Richard Branson looks to investing in the Manor, the first proper live-in recording studio in Britain.
I found the Manor in a Frank Knight and Rutley. It was in the Country Life magazine. Richard was 19, I was 29.
We bought this old manor house in Oxford. I'd managed to get a mortgage from the bank, and then on the second mortgage managed to find an aunt to lend us $10,000 on a second mortgage.
We thought that, you know, Silver Spoon, Richard had got all this easily, but he had to pay back about 5% above the bank rate to Auntie Joyce on a regular basis. She gave him no favours at all.
And lo and behold, who goes there but Mike Oldfield, doing some recording as a session man.
Michael came to me with this little reel. He was very bad at social intercourse, and he poked his face right. He says, "You've got to listen to this," he said. And I said, I said, all right, I'll listen to this. And it was a little 3-inch reel of the sort of tape that you used to send to your mummy in Australia. Hello, Mum. You know, that kind of stuff.
Yes, it was.
And I said, all right, I'll listen to it. Now, he said. So we would all stop. So I took it upstairs anyway and listened to it on a tape recorder I had upstairs. And I was just captivated.
It was the most beautiful piece of music. I mean, to this day, I can still hear it in my head.
They made a copy. They kept a copy, and they said, you know, we'll speak to, you know, Richard, Simon Draper, and we'll let you know.
I took it into London next time I went to London and played it to Richard. No, I didn't play it to Richard, actually, because we all knew that Richard wouldn't get it.
No, we didn't play it to Richard. That was
No,
the whole thing.
we played it to Simon.
Yes. Yeah.
The other Simon Draper.
Tom played me the demo, and I loved it, and I thought this was absolutely bound to be successful. I had no real means of gauging what success meant, but I just knew this thing would make an impact.
We discussed the problem of Richard being Richard, whose favourite record was Bachelor Boy.
He said, son, you are a bachelor boy, and that's the way to stay.
When I went to work at Virgin, I had quite strong views about what sort of record label we should start. The only person there who knew very little about music was Richard. I don't think he even had a record player at home.
I got a call from Simon Draper, who had heard the demo tape of Tubular Bells, and he was excited by this tape and wanted to come over to the houseboat to play it to me.
I picked up the phone, and it was Simon Draper. He said, "We've been listening to your demos." I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I'd like you to come over to Richard's boat to have dinner." I said, "All right then."
We said we loved it. We didn't really have any spare money to record his album, but we told him just to go and live at the Manor, and in between recording sessions, you know, he could record his album.
I said, "Well, I'm going to need some instruments, you know." And he said, "Just write down what you need, and we'll get it for you."
We were a bit astounded at all these instruments that Mike was ordering, because he needed a lot of instruments.
Acoustic guitar, Spanish guitar, electric guitar, bass guitar.
And they looked horribly expensive to me.
And later on there was the concert timpani. There was a glockenspiel.
Glockenspiel, £9.
Possibly mandolin, I'm not sure.
No, we didn't know anything about anything.
We were fighting to survive in those days.
There was a truck which was delivering my stuff and taking out some stuff of the previous musician, who was John Cale. As they were taking his stuff out, I just watched this set of tubular bells going past, and I just said to the chap, "Can you leave those?"
Never thought that the word tubular bells was going to play such an important part in our lives, and even for the fact that I suppose that, you know, like Virgin going into space most likely wouldn't have existed if we hadn't hired that particular instrument.
And there I was in a real studio, which I could use, you know, a proper multi-track studio, 16 tracks.
And I was amazed that so quickly Mike had gone from this little 2-track in his bedroom to this huge mixing desk, because in those days they were vast.
This is the original master. The piano was recorded to a clockwork metronome ticking away. And I've got live bass here. And I can play around with some keyboards. And it starts off with the piano, it's a familiar piano. Then the glockenspiel comes in and the Farfisler organ. So. Comes the Glock and the Farfisler. It's the same old pattern here. Then I got the live bass now. The little harmony comes in there. And then we wanted to have, it was supposed to be, you know, when horns go bap, you know, like in, you know, the big band sound. We couldn't have a horn section, so I just had an organ and mic'd it up, and I played it really loud, like that, you see. And then this is the introduction of that 3/4 time. To me, that represented a human heartbeat made on the left hand of the piano. If you can listen, the piano is going like a heartbeat. And then a bit later on, just coming up, the guitars start, the thing builds up to a big climax. What we're listening to here is unmixed, so it's just completely as it was recorded. But I can plug in the guitar and show you that if you like. Hang on a minute. Whoops. Here we go. There's the guitar. I missed it, you see. Then we've got these two fuzzy guitars coming in a minute, and then it builds up to the big climax. I think they start on this round.
there's a lead up. The melody comes in, the flute comes in. And then I was telling you yesterday about this organ chord that's supposed to go ooh like that. There it is. And then the big, beautiful melody comes. The point really, I suppose, that people would not understand was that when we made it, Michael was a mental wreck. He would walk round with his eyes wet with tears nearly all the time. He was in a terrible state. He found an enormous disquiet about the idea of being mortal flesh, and yet what was going on in his head was eternal and beautiful and everlasting, you know. And that really, my heart went out to him. He always had fag packets in his pocket, and he would suddenly stop and he'd write in tiny little writing. He'd slash 5 staves on it and write a little tune on it and put it back in the fag packet, and then he, you know, carry on. So he was constantly, you know, working.
What's so interesting about Tubular Bells, if you view it in totality, it's like a compendium of tunes, textures, ideas.
There's a honky-tonk piano, you see. That's all the kitchen staff from the manor. They got them all in from their cooking, and that was a honky-tonk piano like my grandma's.
Oldfield had been like sort of working up to this point for a number of years, so not surprisingly, therefore, you get elements of the school band in it. You remember that don, do don, do don, do do do.
I like this bit. We'll turn it up. See, it's got everything in it. It's got the pub piano, it's got the, you know, the thrash rock.
The big question when you've got this compendium of tunes is how do you find a kind of climax point? How do you find a tune which is going to kind of burn a hole in people's souls?
I mean, the tension there, you see.
Yeah, it's phenomenal, isn't it?
This is the build-up to the riff, yeah.
Yeah, this is the build-up to the bass guitar riff.
The bass line was very hard work. The one that I hired wasn't particularly nice to play. I had to play it all in one go for about 7 minutes.
And that whole part, right from there to the very end, was all in one take.
See, even now, my muscles starting to tire. I can feel a little bit of sweat coming out of my head, but I had to keep going on. So I'm starting to get tired now, but I had to keep going.
The accident of getting Vivian Stanchel involved in that was great as well.
Ground piano.
Vivian was with the Bonzo Dog Doodah band, and they'd been recording already. Vivian was around and was getting drunk because he would drink a bottle of brandy, you know, for tea. You couldn't keep him out of anything. He would just blunder in and, "Hey, dear boy, what's going on in here?" And that was it. You know, you had to give in to him.
And from behind the magnificent 20th century Norman portals, you'll find the downstairs lavatory and me seated toying with my worms.
Michael said to me, "Wouldn't it be great to get Vivian to introduce the instruments?" I said, "Well, go and ask him." I can't do that, I'm scared. And eventually I made him go and ask him. I said, "Go and ask him, go and ask him. Go ask him, say you want a slug of his brandy."
By the way, while you're watching, why not have a glass of Chateau Tilbury at river temperature? It's absolutely delicious.
I just gave him the words and I wrote them down. It's the cast in order of appearance. It starts with the grand piano.
We could not cue the fucker at all. It was a nightmare. He was grand piano in completely the wrong place, you know.
Next comes in at the beginning, reed and pipe organ.
Reed and pipe organ. Reed and pipe organ. I love him.
I couldn't believe my luck, especially when he said plus tubular bells and the bells hit. I was over the moon because it just sounded so perfect.
Plus tubular bells.
The thing about the tubular bells is that it's an instrument that normally is quite far back in an orchestra. And, you know, in this case, we wanted the tubular bells to be the loudest instrument.
We had a lot of arguments about that, me and Tom.
He was asking for the impossible, virtually, within the technology we had.
We nearly came to blows about it, you know. It's got to be loud, and the bell's got to be that loud. I don't care if we had to bring the whole track down. And we said, well, then it'll sound too quiet on the radio, you know. It doesn't matter, the bell, let them turn their radios up.
I said, because they come with this neat little hammer with a leather on one end and copper on the other end, I think. And it was even hitting it with the copper, it didn't work.
So we got a real hammer.
Got a real claw hammer, bloody great. 12-ounce claw hammer. I said, look, just hit it.
There we have the bell.
Tubular bells.
We worked all night, finished Sidebar about 8 or 9 in the morning. And a copy was sent off to London. I didn't hear anything until that evening.
Richard's reaction to the first side of Tubular Bells was it hasn't got any vocals on it. It was a major nightmare in his head about what we do with this.
We went to the Midem Music Conference in Cannes in order to try and gauge interest in our product, which we hadn't obviously released anything at this point, and see whether we could set up overseas licensing deals.
I definitely remember when I took the tape around some record companies, one of the record company bosses saying, you know, he wanted to put some vocals on it. If we put some vocals on it, he'd sign Mike up.
Well, Richard, when he came back, he said, should we try and put vocals on it? And he may well have mentioned it to Mike, but I don't think anyone else thought this was a good idea. And certainly Mike didn't.
Eventually it was decided that I could stay on in the house, and whenever the studio wasn't being used, I could go in there and work on side 2 of Tubular Bells. I had all the sections mapped out. I had the Caveman mapped out. I had the beautiful, peaceful tune.
When the time came to choose the sleeve, the design and so on, we introduced Mike to Trevor Key.
He did all this all on his own. I just looked at it and went, oh, wow. The jaw dropped at just how amazingly beautiful it was. This is a actual real object which was built, but then it was chromium plated. As I understand it, it didn't have a back, so it wasn't like completely solid all the way round. Trevor asked me what kind of typeface, and I said, well, I don't want to be big plastered all over it. Leave this beautiful picture. You can put Tubular Bells there. I chose the colour. I put my name very small because I didn't want the type to destroy the image, you see.
Tubular Bells became the premier Virgin release. There it was, V2001, 25th of May 1973. The label was launched with this piece of music. An album with one track on it, over 2 sides. You know, that's different.
Richard Branson rang me up. How would you like to come up to my recording studio and meet Mike Oldfield? Now, Mike was hard work. He didn't want to answer the sort of questions I wanted to ask.
Well, I mean, remember, I hated it. He was asking me all these personal questions.
Tell me about Tubular Bells. Mumble, mumble, mumble. He was not the greatest interviewee in the world, especially at this time.
Why did you write Tubular Bells? Oh, weird question.
It's a bit silly, isn't it? I think it is.
I can't imagine me asking such a question. It's a stupid question.
I racked my brains for 20 minutes and I couldn't think. There wasn't a reason. I didn't want to have a... I didn't do it for that. You know, it's just...
At the end, I said, how was that? It wasn't all that painful, was it? He said, I feel as if I've been raped.
I was taken into a room by Richard, Tom, I think the lot of them. And they sat me down and they said, you're going to have to do this live. I said, no, absolutely not. You know, I'd become a bit of a rebel by that time.
I hadn't realised quite how big a problem that we had with Mike. To be frank, he had a sort of mental problem. I mean, you know, and he wouldn't disagree with that at that time. He said he didn't want to go on tour, but he agreed to do one concert.
I was pushed and pushed, and there was no getting out of it. All right, so what have I let myself in for?
We assembled a group of musicians, many of whom were signed to the label by this time. So it was members of Hatfield and the North, Henry Cow, and then Mick Taylor played guitar on it.
The Queen Elizabeth Hall was suggested, nice size, predominantly a classical venue.
Interesting, isn't it, that Branson decided that for the one live appearance of Tubular Bells, that it should be in one of the great kind of hallowed bastions of culture. You know, he wasn't putting it on at a rock venue. So there's quite a strong statement behind that, I think. He wanted it to be seen as a piece of artwork.
I'd started getting nervous about it by then, because I was thinking, oh my God, I've got to do this live. You know, there was no sampling then, there was no backing tracks. We all had to play everything.
As we got closer to the gig, Michael got more and more scared. I mean, he was really scared.
I remember the rehearsals. We were going over and over this piece, and Mike suddenly burst into tears and left the room because he just couldn't handle it. He was just so emotionally... It was so difficult for him.
I'd been given an old beaten-up Bentley for my wedding present, so I was driving him, you know, to the concert, and suddenly he turned to me and said, you know, Richard, I'm sorry, I just can't do it. I just can't do it. This was about an hour and a half, and the concert was sold out. I kept driving, and he just said, Richard, you're not taking me seriously. I'm not going on stage. And I just desperately trying to think, what the hell do I do now? And then I just turned to him and said, look, Mike, if I give you the keys to this car and you can drive this car off after the concert, do you think you can overcome, you know, whatever's bothering you?
Our live from London radio concert comes tonight from the Queen Elizabeth Hall and features Michael Oldfield performing his composition Tubular Bells.
We got off on the stage and started.
David Bedford came in out of time, and Mick Taylor's guitar wasn't quite in tune.
I was just waiting for the silence and the booze and the fruit they were going to throw at me because it was so awful. And then just to my amazement, there was this roar.
Everybody, standing ovation straight away. It was instant.
We all had tears in our eyes, and Tubular Bells was born, Mike Oldfield was born, Virgin Records was born.
He couldn't understand it. He said, "What the fuck are they standing up clapping for? That was crap." You know, I mean, he was really amazed.
I felt that I'd done it so badly that perhaps I didn't deserve that, reaction, that reward.
John Peel came to the boat one day. Simon Draper and myself played him the whole album, and he absolutely loved it. And he chose to play the whole album on his radio show, which was unheard of.
Well, I've been introducing Top Gear for nearly 6 years now, but I think that is certainly one of the most impressive LPs that I've ever had the chance to play on the radio. Really a remarkable record from Mike Oldfield, and one of the first releases on the new Virgin label.
John Peel was responsible for breaking so many bands.
It was a very influential club, it was a very select club. It was like, let me let you in on this secret.
I remember a kid coming into school with a copy of Tubular Bells and us all just looking at the sleeve and thinking, what is it?
We had a mate's house that we'd go to. He lived near school, so we were able to get a fix at lunchtime as well, and we'd go off and listen to it there.
Well, records used to happen through word of mouth then. Somebody would buy it, take it home, play it, and another person would then want to buy it. There was no internet or no communication like that. It just began to explode, it evolved.
Well, I can remember going to an Italian restaurant in Little Venice with Richard shortly before the record actually came out, and we were trying to guess what it would sell, and we absolutely had no idea.
And we knew nothing about the industry, but we thought we might sell 4,000 copies.
It took a while, you see. It crept and crept and crept. It didn't do things like things do nowadays, go in at #1. It took probably about a year.
It was quite a warm summer, and I can remember hearing it coming out of windows, and you thought, boy, this is happening. You know, this is word of mouth.
But I think what made it different was the fact it sort of kept on going. It started to attract much bigger audiences. It became a talking point.
I suppose as it started getting successful, I was thinking maybe I'd have the opportunity to not get involved and be a star or anything, which is to get out, go away.
Mike had a very difficult time with the fame of Tubular Bells. And locked himself on the top of the remotest hill he could find in Wales. And lots of people calling him, saying, "We want you to do this, we want you to do that." No, go away.
Every year, it seems, a film is released with scenes in it so disgusting or so disturbing that controversy is stirred up over whether it should be shown or not. A strong contender for the title this year is this film, The Exorcist, which was released yesterday in London.
The Exorcist, which was one of the biggest box office hits of all time, opened late in 1973, but very close to the opening. They'd thrown out the original score, and they were looking for music to fill the gap. And the director, William Friedkin, was in the offices of Ahmet Ertegun, head of Atlantic Records in America, and he came across an anonymous-looking record with a white label. And he took it out of the sleeve and he put it on the record player there in Ertegun's office, and he put the needle on and it went da-dum, dum, da-dum, and he went, that.
Mom, you should have seen this man came along on this beautiful grey horse.
Firstly, he heard the childlike thing, because obviously the centre of The Exorcist is the story of a young girl who's possessed by some demon. The second thing he heard was that the notes are very simple, but there's something about the time structure that's odd.
The way it is, it's 1 bar 7, 1 bar 8, so it'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
If that was just 2 simple bars of all of 8 notes each bar, the brain would switch off after a while. But because every other one trips you up, you can't not concentrate on it.
I think I'll walk home tonight, Mike. Okay. You take that drop by my house.
There's a couple of moments when it appears.
Hi, Pop.
Chris comes walking down the street As she comes round the corner and starts walking down the street, you hear dun 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 dun. There are these kind of strange little gusts of wind. A group of kids run by wearing Halloween masks, which is sort of an indicator of stuff that's to come. There's a low-angle shot of nuns with their habits sort of blowing in a kind of, slightly gothic way. Later on, when the doctors are trying to diagnose what's happened to Regan, you see a closed-circuit television feed of her in a hospital bed raging.
It looks like the type of disorder that's rarely ever seen anymore, except in primitive cultures. We call it somnambuliform possession.
And so you have this really strange thing, which is these very brief uses of that piece of music. Somehow it becomes the theme from The Exorcist.
The Exorcist was hugely important in breaking Mike in America. The album went top 5. I mean, it won the Grammy for Best Instrumental Album. And at that juncture, Mike could have gone and capitalised on that and could have been a huge American star.
After The Exorcist, where obviously he'd become very well known, I think he was really in quite a bad way. And I think really he had nobody to turn to. He seemed very distressed. He seemed very alone. It wasn't unusual to find him on his own, because we'd always known he'd lock himself in his bedroom and do his music. But it was a very different type of loneliness, I got the impression.
I do remember my mother coming and visiting, and she was going very much downhill at the time. And I do remember sitting in the car with her. That's probably the last time I saw her, actually. And because I was suffering too, and she looked at me and said, "You know what it's like, Mike, don't you?" And I said, yeah, I do. And then, of course, the question came, the follow-up. We're talking about Tubular Bells, but the follow-up was a nightmare.
What Mike needed, and obviously what Virgin needed as well, was for Mike not to be just known for Tubular Bells. And it was important that Tubular Bells, the name Tubular Bells, didn't become bigger than Mike Oldfield.
And Richard was so eager for me to do something that I looked at the first thing and I said, "What's that?" "Oh, it's Hergest Ridge." "All right, well, I'll do a album called Hergest Ridge, and I'll make it about kind of old, legendary things, and it'll have little whistles in it, and then it'll have things that sound like wild horses and all that."
He didn't want to do a follow-up that quickly because he drained himself, he'd spent himself completely.
And I was kind of disappointed with lots of the ideas I was coming up. I was waiting for the big one. Didn't realise that I've already done the big one.
It was really tough to follow such an enormous album like Tubular Bells. It didn't capture people's imagination in the same way that Tubular Bells did.
To be honest, it's not my favourite album either. I remember I was recording it with Tom, and we kind of got bored. It was a nice sunny day, so we went flying model aeroplanes instead.
After Ommadawn, his third album, we then went through a sort of lull period for a while. We had other artists that did reasonably well, but we then needed, we needed a new shot in the arm.
You'll burn the street. You'll burn your houses with anxiety.
By the time we got to punk, the reaction was, "Don't play me that hippie shit." And the whole thing with punk was 3 chords and the truth, in and out, under 3 minutes. The idea of putting on one side of an album and it being one piece of music was complete anathema.
The whole punk thing happened, and they were calling me rude names in the press for no reason.
We had the Sex Pistols and Magazine and the Skids and so on, the Ruts. Virgin started having a lot of hit singles.
I must say I felt betrayed because Richard suddenly jumped on that bandwagon and Virgin became the punk label. After a year or two, I just ran out of steam and I didn't know what to do, and I got really depressed, and I started maybe drinking too much alcohol. It was in about 1978 I got involved with this self-awareness group called Exegesis.
This group of 58 people has just completed a seminar which many of them now believe has transformed their lives. It lasted 3 days and cost them £175 each.
One of their, they called them processes, seemed to be a combination of a primal scream therapy and a rebirth therapy.
This seminar does not function under the same laws and rules that your life does out there.
I had to lie down on the floor, and he said, "Okay, right, it's the time now." I thought, "Oh my God, it's going to be, it's like facing a firing squad for me." You know, I was terrified. And he said, "Okay, just start making a noise."
Start to put the feelings of your body into a sound.
Gradually, the noise I made became louder and louder and louder, until it turned into a kind of a shouting, and then it turned into, after a few minutes, into a scream like you wouldn't believe. I was screaming at the top of my voice. What they did was they held me up by my feet, and these people all around me pushed these cushions into my body, so I felt like completely cocooned. And then very gradually I calmed down and laid me down on the ground. And I cannot describe the feeling that I felt, because I felt the wetness of a newborn infant.
That's it. Good night.
I was on a high like you wouldn't believe. And I did all kinds of strange things which I'd never done before. Like, instead of shunning all interviews, I suddenly wanted to talk to everybody. And it turned him into a kind of mini monster for a period. Firm handshake, leaning forward into the, it was so uncharacteristic and wrong.
The hair is cut, the beard is gone, he's got no clothes on the front of music mags. He's doing a version of the Blue Peter theme. It's just this completely different character. And bear in mind, he's still not 30.
The worst thing he ever did was to do that rebirthing thing. That might sound cruel, because I'm sure he's more comfortable in himself dealing with the rest of the world. I think that since that rebirthing thing, he's found it very hard to reach the places where the real music came from. Because I think the music that Michael made was the grist of his pain. He didn't want to do the pain anymore, quite reasonably so, I suppose, but it was the pain that was bringing the music through.
About 5 years that lasted, and I did all the things I hadn't been able to do. It was like an incredible high. It sort of wore off.
It really worked for Mike, but it didn't last, because all it does is give you a glimpse, but then all the automation kicks in again after a few weeks. The emotional undercurrents were so strong, it had been held back for so long. The powerful force of that anguish was still there, and it was trying to come through.
Then there was the passing away of my mother. I had to deal with the grief of that. That was a terrible loss. Best way I can describe that was a big balloon bursting full of grief, and I had to let it out.
Right now, I see that Mike is opening up in a way that he's never opened up before. Because the music that Mike's come up with has touched people in a way that's just so amazing. He's given so much. He deserves something back. Not just the money, which he spends has spent in the past to create a wall, build big walls around himself. The money doesn't help.
Our starting point was music. For the second sequence in the Olympic ceremony, it was Tubular Bells that we wanted to actually make a cornerstone of 20 minutes of the evening.
Please welcome Mike Oldfield and the staff of the United Kingdom National Health Service.
It's tricky because you think, how's he going to react? You know, we're not going to be able to play all 40-odd minutes of it. You know, it's going to be a cut-down version. And I have to say, of all the collaborators that we worked with on it, he was extraordinary. Not only the ability to manipulate that tune in different ways, but also his appetite for it was amazing. He's had to be very, very protective of the work, understandably. But with us, he was like... We started to put it together with this sequence which was born out of children's literature and caring and the villains in children's literature, because the theme tune of The Exorcist, that made sense as a starting point for it, and then the celebratory sense of Tubular Bells was also good because we wanted to celebrate the NHS and we wanted to use a lot of the staff from the NHS to learn dancing.
Here we are 40 years later, this little piece of music I had when I was in this terrible panic-stricken situation. I was standing there on the stage, you know, live in front of this massive audience and thinking, I remember writing that all those years ago. And there was these thousands of people and millions of people watching it, and it was going out across the planet. It was magnificent.
I think he'd arrived at a point where he thought this would be a wonderful way to celebrate the album nationally, because it does belong, I mean, he lives abroad now, but it does belong to Britain. It's born, I think it is born out of our culture. The most extraordinary pleasure in the album is that he brings it all together, that feeling of something experimental being brought together and complete, because everyone can experiment, you know, and everyone can doodle and go off strange places, and they're fascinating. But to complete it and to give a sense of wholeness, that he brings you to the end of a journey, is amazing, really. And it feels the sense of satisfaction and completion you get from that is the reason that it's successful. To have that kind of mainstream public appeal for something so weird without vocals over such a long space of time, to have that much public appeal means it's a masterpiece, I think.